Have you ever wondered who Abraham's first son really was? Most people would instantly say Isaac, the miracle child born to Sarah in her old age. But here's the shocking truth that's been hiding in plain sight for thousands of years. Abraham's first son wasn't Isaac at all. It was Ishmael, born 14 years earlier to an Egyptian servant named Hagar. And the story behind his birth, his exile, and his legacy is one of the most scandalous family dramas ever recorded in the biblical history. This isn't just ancient history. This is a story that shaped 3 major world religions, ignited conflicts that continue to this day, and reveals uncomfortable truths about favoritism, jealousy, and divine justice that most religious leaders would rather not discuss. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this family scandal has been quietly influencing global politics for over 4,000 years. If you're ready to uncover the hidden truth about Abraham's first son and the scandal that changed everything, type Y in the comments. And make sure to hit that subscribe button, because we're about to dive into one of the most controversial stories in the Bible that most people have never heard the full truth about. Let's start from the beginning, because the story of Abraham's first son begins with desperation, deception, and a decision that would echo through eternity. Picture this. Abraham, then called Abram, is 75 years old when God makes him an incredible promise. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. But there's one massive problem. Abraham has no children. His wife Sarah, then called Sarai, is barren. And as the years tick by, that divine promise seems more and more impossible. 10 years pass. Abraham is now 85, and Sarah is approaching 80. In their culture, in their time, a woman who couldn't bear children was considered cursed. The shame was unbearable. The pressure was crushing. And Sarah was watching her biological clock not just tick, but explode. So Sarah makes a decision that will change the course of human history. Following the customs of her time, she approaches Abraham with a proposal that sounds reasonable on the surface, but is loaded with emotional dynamite. Go into my servant Hagar. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Now pause right here. This wasn't just about having a baby. This was about survival, inheritance, and the continuation of God's promise. In ancient Near Eastern culture, if a wife couldn't produce an heir, she could legally give her servant to her husband as a surrogate. The child born from this union would legally belong to the wife, not the servant. It was a desperate solution to a desperate problem. But who was Hagar? Here's where the story gets even more intriguing. Hagar wasn't just any servant. She was Egyptian, and according to ancient Jewish traditions, she may have been a princess. Some sources suggest that Hagar was actually a gift from Pharaoh himself when Abraham and Sarah had traveled to Egypt years earlier during a famine. Remember that scandalous incident? Abraham, fearing for his life, had told Sarah to lie and say she was his sister instead of his wife. When Pharaoh's officials saw Sarah's beauty and brought her into Pharaoh's palace, Pharaoh showered Abraham with gifts, including livestock, servants, and possibly Hagar herself. So Hagar wasn't just any servant. She was a royal gift, a woman of status who had been reduced to serving in Abraham's household. Can you imagine the dynamics here? Hagar, possibly former royalty, now serving a woman who couldn't even fulfill her most basic wifely duty of producing an heir. And now that same woman is essentially offering her to her husband as a breeding machine. Abraham agrees to Sarah's plan, and here's what's shocking. The Bible doesn't record any hesitation, any prayer, any seeking of God's will. Abraham simply went into Hagar, and she conceived. Just like that. 9 months later, when Abraham is 86 years old, Ishmael is born. The name Ishmael itself tells a story. It means God hears. But heard what exactly? Hagar's pain? Her humiliation? Her desperate cries for help? Because what happened next reveals the ugly truth about family dynamics when desperation meets human nature. The moment Hagar conceived, everything changed. Scripture tells us that when Hagar saw she was pregnant, her mistress became despised in her eyes. Think about this psychologically. Hagar, the servant, the foreigner, the woman with no rights, suddenly had something Sarah didn't have. She was carrying Abraham's child. She was succeeding where Sarah had failed for decades. And Sarah's response? Fury, jealousy, rage. She blamed Abraham, saying, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes." But here's the twisted part. Sarah had orchestrated this entire situation. She had pushed for this arrangement. She had given Hagar to Abraham, and now she was angry at the very success she had engineered. Abraham's response reveals something troubling about his character. Instead of protecting Hagar, the woman carrying his child, he essentially throws her under the bus. "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." And Sarah did. She dealt so harshly with Hagar that the pregnant woman fled into the wilderness, preferring to face death in the desert rather than endure Sarah's abuse. Picture this scene. A pregnant Egyptian woman, alone in the wilderness with no food, no water, no protection. She's been abused by her mistress and abandoned by the father of her child. She's facing certain death. And this is where the story takes a supernatural turn. An angel of the Lord finds Hagar by a spring in the wilderness. Not just any angel, but the angel of the Lord, a being so significant that many scholars believe this was a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ himself. And this divine being doesn't just offer comfort. He makes promises that will reshape the future of the world. "Return to your mistress and submit to her," the angel commands. But then comes the promise that changes everything. "I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude." The angel tells her to name her son Ishmael, "for the Lord has listened to your affliction." But then comes a prophecy that sounds almost like a warning. "He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen." Hagar obeys and returns. Ishmael is born. And for 14 years, he is Abraham's only son. 14 years where he's the heir apparent, the beloved child, the one through whom God's promises seem destined to be fulfilled. 14 years of being the center of Abraham's world. But God has other plans. When Abraham is 99 and Sarah is 89, God appears to Abraham again with news that will shatter this family dynamic forever. Sarah will have a son, not through a servant, not through a surrogate, but miraculously, supernaturally, through her own womb. Abraham's response is telling. He falls on his face and laughs, not with joy, but with incredulity. Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? Then Abraham says something that reveals his heart. "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." Abraham loves his first son. He wants Ishmael to be the heir. He's pleading with God to just let his plan with Ishmael work out. But God's response is firm. "No, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him." Notice what God does next. He doesn't ignore Ishmael. "As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation." A year later, Isaac is born. And that's when the real scandal begins, because now Abraham has 2 sons. The first son, Ishmael, born of human effort, human planning, human desperation. And the second son, Isaac, born of divine promise, divine timing, divine miracle. But here's what's shocking. Even though Isaac is the miracle child, the promised heir, the Bible consistently refers to Ishmael as Abraham's firstborn. There's no attempt to hide this fact or minimize Ishmael's significance. He is, by every measure, Abraham's first son. The tension between these two realities, between human effort and divine promise, between the first son and the chosen son, sets up a family drama that will explode in ways no one could have predicted. Because in ancient culture, the firstborn son had specific rights, specific privileges, and a specific inheritance that couldn't simply be ignored. What happens next will reveal ugly truths about human nature, divine justice, and family loyalty that continue to shape our world today. The scandal isn't just about who was born first. It's about what happens when God's promises seem to conflict with human expectations, when divine favor appears to contradict natural law, and when a family must choose between the son of the flesh and the son of the promise. The celebration of Isaac's weaning should have been a moment of pure joy. In ancient culture, when a child survived those dangerous early years and was weaned from his mother's breast, it marked a milestone worthy of a great feast. Abraham threw an elaborate party, inviting friends and neighbors to celebrate this precious gift that God had given them in their old age. But at this celebration, something happened that would tear the family apart forever. The Bible simply says that Sarah saw Ishmael mocking or playing with Isaac, but that innocent-sounding phrase masks a much darker reality that scholars have debated for centuries. What exactly was Ishmael doing? Some traditions suggest he wasn't just teasing his little brother. Some ancient sources claim Ishmael was engaging in idol worship, building pagan altars and offering sacrifices right there at the celebration. Others say he was making jokes about Isaac's legitimacy, mocking the idea that this baby would inherit everything while he, the firstborn, would get nothing. But here's what makes this truly scandalous. Ishmael wasn't a child when this happened. He was approximately 17 years old. This wasn't innocent sibling rivalry. This was a teenager who had spent 14 years as the beloved only son, suddenly watching his entire future disappear because of a baby brother. Think about the psychology here. For nearly 2 decades, Ishmael had been Abraham's pride and joy. He had been circumcised as part of God's covenant. He had been raised as the heir apparent. Everyone in Abraham's household knew that Ishmael would inherit everything. And now, suddenly, everything had changed. Sarah's reaction was swift and brutal. She marched up to Abraham and delivered an ultimatum that would echo through history. Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit with my son Isaac. Notice Sarah's language. She doesn't even use Hagar's name. She calls her the slave woman, and Ishmael? He's not Abraham's son anymore. He's the son of this slave woman. Sarah is systematically dehumanizing them, reducing them to their lowest social status to make her demand seem reasonable. But Abraham is torn apart by this request. The Bible says he was very displeased because of his son. The Hebrew word used here suggests deep grief, anguish, and distress. Abraham loves Ishmael. Despite everything, despite the complicated circumstances of his birth, despite the family drama, Abraham genuinely loves his firstborn son. This is where the story becomes a theological minefield, because God himself intervenes in this family dispute. And his response is shocking. God tells Abraham, "Be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named." Wait, let's pause here. The God of justice, the God of mercy, the God who hears the cries of the oppressed, is telling Abraham to exile his own son, to send a teenage boy and his mother into the wilderness with nothing but some bread and water. But then God adds something crucial. "And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also because he is your offspring." God isn't abandoning Ishmael. He's redirecting his destiny. The next morning, Abraham gives Hagar some bread and a skin of water, puts them on her shoulder along with the boy, and sends them away. Can you imagine this scene? Abraham, the great patriarch, the friend of God, essentially banishing his own flesh and blood because his wife demanded it. Hagar and Ishmael wander into the wilderness of Beersheba. And here's where the story becomes heartbreaking. The water runs out. In the scorching desert heat, with no oasis in sight, death becomes a certainty. Hagar can't bear to watch her son die, so she puts him under a bush and sits down about a bowshot away, saying, "Let me not look on the death of the child." Picture this moment. A mother sitting in the sand, waiting for her teenage son to die of thirst. And both of them crying out, their voices echoing across the empty wilderness. But then, miracle. The angel of God calls to Hagar from heaven. "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy, and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation." And then God opens Hagar's eyes, and she sees a well of water. They drink, they live, and Ishmael grows up in the wilderness, becoming an expert archer. But here's what's truly scandalous about this entire episode. The Bible tells us that God was with the boy as he grew up. Think about that. While Isaac is being raised in Abraham's household, surrounded by wealth and comfort and the covenant promises, Ishmael is in the wilderness. And God is with him too. This creates a theological problem that most people prefer to ignore. If God is with Ishmael, if God has promised to make him into a great nation, if God has blessed him and heard his cries, then what does that say about the nature of divine election? What does it mean when God has two plans running simultaneously for two brothers? The scandal deepens when we realize that both sons are living under divine blessing, but in completely different ways. Isaac receives the covenant, the promises, the inheritance. But Ishmael receives something else. He receives survival skills, independence, and a destiny that will span continents. According to the Bible, Ishmael fathers 12 princes, just as God promised. His descendants multiply and spread across the Arabian Peninsula. They become traders, warriors, nomads who know how to survive in the harshest conditions. They develop their own culture, their own traditions, their own relationship with the divine. But here's where it gets really controversial. Many Arab peoples trace their lineage back to Ishmael. And centuries later, when Islam emerges, the Prophet Muhammad claims descent from Ishmael's line. Suddenly, this family drama from 4,000 years ago becomes the foundation for a religious tradition that will encompass over 1 billion people. Islamic tradition tells the story differently. In their version, it was Ishmael, not Isaac, whom Abraham was commanded to sacrifice. It was Ishmael who helped Abraham build the Kaaba in Mecca. It was Ishmael who became the true spiritual heir of Abraham's legacy. This creates one of the most enduring religious controversies in human history. Judaism and Christianity trace their spiritual lineage through Isaac. Islam traces its lineage through Ishmael. Both claim to be the true heirs of Abraham's covenant. Both believe they are the chosen people. And both have scriptural evidence to support their claims. But here's what makes this scandal even more complex. The Bible itself seems conflicted about Ishmael's status. On one hand, it clearly states that Isaac is the child of promise, the heir through whom God's covenant will continue. But on the other hand, it records God's explicit blessings on Ishmael, his protection of Hagar, and his promise to make Ishmael into a great nation. Even more shocking, when Abraham dies, both sons come together to bury their father. Isaac and Ishmael, the chosen son and the exiled son, standing side by side at Abraham's grave. Whatever bitterness existed between them seems to have been resolved in adulthood. They honored their father together, suggesting that the family wounds had somehow healed. But the theological implications of their reconciliation raise even more questions. If both brothers were blessed by God, if both fulfilled divine purposes, if both became fathers of great nations, then what was the point of the exile? Why did Sarah's jealousy have to tear the family apart? Why couldn't both sons have shared Abraham's inheritance? Some scholars suggest that the separation was necessary for both boys to fulfill their destinies. Isaac needed to be raised in the covenant community, learning the ways of faith and obedience that would prepare him to carry on Abraham's spiritual legacy. Ishmael needed to be forged in the wilderness, developing the strength and independence that would enable his descendants to survive and thrive in harsh environments. But that explanation still doesn't resolve the moral complexity of the situation. A teenage boy was exiled because of his stepmother's jealousy. A mother was forced to watch her child nearly die of thirst in the desert. A father was compelled to choose between his wife's demands and his love for his firstborn son. The scandal isn't just about family dynamics. It's about the nature of God's justice. How can a righteous God allow the innocent to suffer for the sins and schemes of others? How can divine promises be fulfilled through human cruelty? How can the same God who protects the oppressed also command the oppression of the innocent? These questions become even more troubling when we consider the long-term consequences of this family split. The descendants of Isaac and Ishmael have been in conflict for millennia. Wars have been fought, blood has been shed, and hatred has been passed down through generations, all tracing back to this moment when Sarah demanded that Hagar and Ishmael be cast out. Yet both lineages have also produced remarkable contributions to human civilization. Through Isaac's line came the Jewish people, who gave the world monotheism, the concept of ethical behavior, and the foundation for both Christianity and Islam. Through Ishmael's line came the Arab peoples, who preserved ancient knowledge, advanced mathematics and science, and created a religious tradition that emphasizes submission to the divine will. The scandal of Abraham's first son isn't just ancient history. It's a living reality that continues to shape our world. Every conflict in the Middle East, every tension between Jews and Arabs, every debate about religious legitimacy can be traced back to this family drama that began with Sarah's desperate plan and exploded with her jealous demand. But perhaps the most scandalous aspect of this entire story is what it reveals about the nature of divine providence. God doesn't always work through the people we expect or in the ways we think are fair. Sometimes His purposes are fulfilled through suffering, through exile, through the very injustices that make us question His character. The story of Abraham's first son forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about favoritism, about the cost of divine election, and about the way God's plans often seem to conflict with human notions of justice and fairness. It's a scandal that has been hiding in plain sight for 4,000 years, shaping religions, fueling conflicts, and challenging our understanding of divine love and justice. And yet, the story doesn't end with exile and separation, because what happens next reveals perhaps the most shocking twist of all. Abraham's first son, the boy who was cast out into the wilderness, doesn't just survive, he thrives. And the way he thrives challenges everything we think we know about divine blessing and favor. Ishmael grows up to become an expert archer in the wilderness of Paran. But here's what's remarkable about this detail. In ancient cultures, archery wasn't just a hunting skill. It was a military skill. It was the mark of a warrior, a leader, someone who could protect and provide for others. While Isaac is learning to tend flocks and manage household affairs, Ishmael is becoming a master of survival and warfare. The Bible tells us that Hagar found a wife for Ishmael from Egypt, her homeland. This isn't just a footnote. This is Hagar reclaiming her heritage, her connections, her power. She's not just a cast-off servant anymore. She's a mother building a dynasty, forging alliances, and establishing her son's future in ways that would have been impossible if they had stayed in Abraham's household. Think about the irony here. Sarah cast out Hagar and Ishmael to protect Isaac's inheritance. But by doing so, she actually freed them to build something entirely their own. Something that couldn't be taken away, couldn't be contested, couldn't be diminished by anyone else's claims or jealousies. But here's where the scandal deepens even further. Islamic tradition preserves details about Ishmael's life that the Bible doesn't include. According to these accounts, after Hagar and Ishmael settled in the valley of Mecca, Abraham didn't just abandon them forever. He visited them regularly. Some traditions say he came every year to see his firstborn son. Can you imagine these reunion scenes? Abraham, the wealthy patriarch, traveling hundreds of miles through dangerous territory just to spend time with the son he was forced to exile. Sarah back home, probably unaware that her husband was maintaining a relationship with the very people she had demanded he cast out. This creates a scandal within the scandal. If Abraham was visiting Ishmael, if he was maintaining a father-son relationship despite the exile, then what does that say about the family dynamics we thought we understood? Was Abraham secretly defying Sarah's wishes? Was he living a double life, honoring his wife's demands publicly while privately nurturing his relationship with his firstborn? Islamic tradition goes even further. It claims that Abraham and Ishmael worked together to build the Kaaba, the sacred structure that would become the holiest site in Islam. Picture this scene. Father and son, the patriarch and the exile, laboring side by side to construct something that would endure for millennia. Not just a building, but a symbol of their restored relationship and their shared devotion to the divine. If these traditions have any historical basis, then the story we've been told is incomplete. The exile wasn't the end of Abraham and Ishmael's relationship. It was a painful interruption, but not a permanent severing. The scandal isn't just about a family torn apart. It's about a family that found ways to heal despite the forces trying to keep them divided. But let's dig deeper into what this means for our understanding of divine justice. Because if God blessed both sons, if both fulfilled divine purposes, if both became fathers of great nations, then we have to ask some uncomfortable questions about the nature of favoritism and election. Why does God choose some people over others? Why does divine favor seem to follow bloodlines? Why do some children inherit promises while others are sent into the wilderness? These aren't just theological questions. They're deeply personal questions that anyone who's ever felt overlooked, abandoned, or unfairly treated has wrestled with. The traditional answer is that God's ways are higher than our ways, that His purposes are beyond our understanding. But Ishmael's story suggests something different. It suggests that God's apparent favoritism might actually be a kind of strategic deployment. Different people are chosen for different purposes, not because some are more valuable than others, but because the overall plan requires diverse contributions. Isaac was chosen to carry forward the covenant, to maintain the spiritual traditions, to preserve the promises for future generations. But Ishmael was chosen for something else entirely. He was chosen to pioneer new territories, to develop new survival skills, to create a different kind of legacy that would complement rather than compete with Isaac's inheritance. This interpretation makes the exile less about punishment and more about preparation. Ishmael couldn't become who he was meant to be while living in Isaac's shadow. He needed his own space, his own challenges, his own relationship with the divine that wasn't filtered through Abraham's household dynamics. But even this more optimistic reading doesn't erase the moral complexity of how the separation happened. Sarah's jealousy was real. Her cruelty was undeniable. The suffering of Hagar and Ishmael was genuine. The fact that good ultimately came from these events doesn't justify the methods used to bring them about. This raises profound questions about the relationship between divine sovereignty and human responsibility. Can God work through human sin to accomplish His purposes? Does the fact that everything worked out in the end mean that Sarah's actions were somehow justified? Or does it mean that God is so powerful that He can redeem even our worst moments and turn them into something beautiful? The scandal deepens when we consider how this family drama has been interpreted and used throughout history. For centuries, Christian theologians used the story of Isaac and Ishmael as an allegory for the relationship between Christianity and Judaism, with Isaac representing the new covenant and Ishmael representing the old. But this interpretation conveniently ignored the fact that both sons were blessed. Both received divine promises, and both fulfilled important roles in God's plan. Similarly, some Jewish interpretations have minimized Ishmael's significance, portraying him as a troublemaker whose exile was necessary and justified. But these interpretations struggle to explain why God continued to bless and protect someone who was supposedly unworthy of divine favor. Islamic tradition takes the opposite approach, elevating Ishmael to equal or even superior status compared to Isaac. But this interpretation requires rejecting significant portions of the biblical narrative and substituting alternative accounts that aren't supported by the earliest sources. The truth is probably more complex than any of these religious interpretations suggest. The scandal of Abraham's first son isn't that one religion got the story right and the others got it wrong. The scandal is that the story itself defies easy categorization. It's messy, morally ambiguous, and resistant to simple explanations. But perhaps that's exactly the point. Perhaps the story is meant to challenge our assumptions about fairness, justice, and divine favor. Perhaps it's meant to force us to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that God's plans often unfold through broken families, human jealousy, and morally questionable decisions. The relationship between Isaac and Ishmael as adults suggests that they may have understood something that their parents missed. When they came together to bury Abraham, they weren't just fulfilling a family obligation. They were demonstrating that the wounds inflicted by one generation don't have to be inherited by the next. This reconciliation between the brothers offers hope for healing divisions that seem permanent and irreconcilable. If Isaac and Ishmael could overcome the trauma of their childhood separation, if they could honor their father together despite everything that had torn their family apart, then perhaps their descendants can find ways to do the same. But the scandal continues to reverberate because the lessons of their reconciliation have been largely forgotten. Instead of seeing Isaac and Ishmael as brothers who found their way back to each other, their descendants have often used their story to justify ongoing conflict and mutual hostility. The real scandal of Abraham's first son isn't just what happened 4,000 years ago. It's what continues to happen today when people use ancient family drama to fuel modern hatred. It's the way a story that ultimately ends in reconciliation has been twisted to justify division. And yet, buried within this ancient scandal is a message of hope that our world desperately needs to hear. The message that families can heal, that brothers can reconcile, that divine blessing isn't a zero-sum game where one person's gain requires another person's loss. The story of Abraham's first son forces us to confront the scandalous possibility that God's love is bigger than our categories, His purpose is more complex than our understanding, and His justice more mysterious than our definitions. It's a scandal that has been hiding in plain sight for millennia, waiting for each generation to discover its relevance anew. But we're not done yet, because the most shocking revelation about Abraham's first son isn't found in what the Bible tells us about his birth, his exile, or even his reconciliation with Isaac. The most shocking revelation is found in what happens to his legacy, how his story gets rewritten by later generations, and why the question of Abraham's first son continues to shape global politics in ways that would astound even Abraham himself. The legacy of Abraham's first son extends far beyond the ancient pages of Scripture into the corridors of modern power, the battlefields of contemporary conflict, and the hearts of billions of people who claim his heritage. But here's where this scandal becomes truly explosive. The way this story has been retold, reinterpreted, and weaponized throughout history reveals uncomfortable truths about how religious narratives shape political realities. Let's fast forward through the centuries and watch how the question of Abraham's first son becomes a geopolitical earthquake that's still shaking our world today. Because what started as a family dispute over inheritance rights has evolved into something that influences everything from Middle Eastern foreign policy to global terrorism to the very survival of nations. In the 7th century, a merchant named Muhammad in the Arabian Peninsula began receiving what he claimed were divine revelations. And at the heart of his message was a stunning reinterpretation of Abraham's story. According to Islamic tradition, it wasn't Isaac who was nearly sacrificed on Mount Moriah. It was Ishmael. It wasn't Isaac who helped build the sacred shrine in Mecca. It was Ishmael. And it wasn't through Isaac's line that the final revelation would come. It was through Ishmael's descendants. This wasn't just a theological disagreement. This was a complete reimagining of sacred history that turned the scandal of Abraham's first son into the foundation of a new world religion. Suddenly, the exiled son became the chosen one. The cast out became the cornerstone. The scandal wasn't that Ishmael was rejected. The scandal was that his true significance had been hidden for over 2,000 years. But here's what makes this reinterpretation truly explosive. It doesn't just challenge Jewish and Christian claims to be Abraham's spiritual heirs. It flips the entire narrative on its head. In Islamic understanding, Ishmael wasn't the problem child who had to be removed for Isaac's sake. He was the faithful son who remained obedient while Isaac's descendants went astray. Think about the psychological impact of this narrative reversal. For centuries, Arab peoples had been told they were descended from the rejected son, the one who wasn't good enough to inherit the promises. But suddenly, they were being told they were actually the true heirs, the faithful remnant, the ones who had preserved authentic monotheism while others had corrupted it. This reframing of Ishmael's significance didn't just create a new religion. It created a new sense of identity, purpose, and destiny for millions of people who had been marginalized by previous interpretations of Abraham's story. The scandal wasn't just personal anymore. It was civilizational. And the consequences have been staggering. Every major conflict in the Middle East can be traced back, at least partially, to competing claims about Abraham's true heirs. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict isn't just about land rights or political sovereignty. It's about whose interpretation of Abraham's story has the right to shape the future of the region. When Jewish immigrants began returning to Palestine in large numbers during the 19th and 20th centuries, they weren't just claiming territory. They were claiming to be Isaac's heirs returning to their promised inheritance. But the Arab populations already living there saw themselves as Ishmael's descendants who had never actually left. Both sides believed they were the rightful inheritors of Abraham's legacy. The scandal deepens when you realize that both claims have legitimate historical and religious foundations. Jewish connection to the land is documented in thousands of years of religious texts, archaeological evidence, and cultural memory. But Arab presence in the region is equally well documented and equally ancient. Both peoples can trace their roots back to Abraham. Both have suffered persecution and displacement. Both believe their survival depends on controlling the same piece of land. This isn't just about competing nationalisms. It's about competing interpretations of divine will. Both sides believe God is on their side, because both sides believe they are Abraham's true heirs. The scandal of Abraham's first son has become a theological justification for political conflict that shows no signs of resolution. But the implications extend far beyond the Middle East. The rise of Islamic terrorism in the modern era often includes explicit references to this ancient family drama. Extremist groups frequently frame their attacks as part of an ongoing conflict between Isaac's descendants and Ishmael's descendants, between the chosen and the rejected, between the oppressor and the oppressed. When terrorists invoke the name of Abraham, they're not just making political statements. They're tapping into a narrative of exile and redemption that goes back 4,000 years. The scandal of Abraham's first son provides a theological framework that transforms political grievances into holy war. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of how this ancient story continues to shape our world. What began as a family dispute has become a source of sacred violence that justifies the killing of innocents in the name of ancient promises and eternal destinies. But here's what's truly scandalous about these modern interpretations. They completely ignore the most important element of the original story: the reconciliation between Isaac and Ishmael. The fact that both brothers came together to honor their father. The clear biblical evidence that God blessed both sons and intended both to fulfill important roles in His plan. Instead of learning from the brothers' example of healing and forgiveness, their supposed descendants have weaponized their childhood trauma to justify ongoing hatred and violence. The scandal isn't just that people are still fighting over Abraham's inheritance. The scandal is that they're using his story to validate behavior that Abraham himself would have condemned. Consider the bitter irony. Abraham is revered by Jews, Christians, and Muslims as the father of faith, the example of obedience to God, the model of righteousness. Yet his family story has become the justification for some of the most faithless, disobedient, and unrighteous behavior in human history. This misuse of Abraham's legacy reveals something deeply troubling about human nature. We have an almost infinite capacity to take stories of redemption and turn them into narratives of revenge. We can take examples of divine mercy and transform them into excuses for human cruelty. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of this entire scandal is what it reveals about the nature of religious truth itself. If three major world religions can look at the same family story and reach completely different conclusions about its meaning, what does that say about the reliability of religious interpretation? Judaism sees Isaac as the chosen heir and views Ishmael's exile as necessary for the preservation of the covenant. Christianity uses the story as an allegory for the relationship between law and grace, with Isaac representing freedom and Ishmael representing bondage. Islam elevates Ishmael to equal or superior status and sees his descendants as the true keepers of Abraham's faith. All three interpretations have theological sophistication and scholarly support. All three have shaped the lives and beliefs of billions of people. And all three claim to represent the authentic meaning of Abraham's story. The scandal isn't that one interpretation is right and the others are wrong. The scandal is that the same story can be used to support radically different and often contradictory worldviews. It suggests that religious texts don't speak for themselves, but are always filtered through the cultural, political, and psychological needs of their interpreters. This interpretive flexibility might seem like a weakness, but it's actually what has allowed Abraham's story to remain relevant across cultures and centuries. Each generation finds in his family drama the themes and lessons that speak to their particular circumstances and challenges. For people struggling with family dysfunction, Abraham's story offers both warning and hope. It shows how human jealousy and favoritism can tear families apart, but it also demonstrates that reconciliation is possible even after devastating betrayal. For those dealing with feelings of rejection or abandonment, Ishmael's story provides a powerful example of how being cast out doesn't mean being forgotten by God. His exile led not to destruction, but to a different kind of blessing and a unique destiny. For communities facing persecution or displacement, both Isaac and Ishmael offer models of survival and faithfulness under pressure. Both sons learn to trust in divine provision even when human support systems failed them. But the scandal of Abraham's first son also forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of divine election and human worth. If God has favorites, what does that mean for those who aren't chosen? If some people are blessed with special promises and privileges, what about those who are left out? These questions become even more troubling when we consider how the doctrine of chosenness has been used throughout history to justify oppression, slavery, and genocide. If some people are God's chosen ones, then others can be treated as less than fully human. The story of Isaac and Ishmael challenges this kind of thinking by showing that divine blessing isn't exclusive or competitive. God's favor toward Isaac didn't require his rejection of Ishmael. Both sons received promises, both were protected, and both fulfilled important roles in the unfolding of divine purpose. This suggests a radically different understanding of election and chosenness. Instead of being about superiority or privilege, it might be about different kinds of service and responsibility. Isaac was chosen to preserve certain traditions and teachings. Ishmael was chosen to pioneer new territories and develop different survival skills. Both were necessary for the complete fulfillment of God's plan. But even this more inclusive interpretation doesn't resolve all the moral complexities of the story. The suffering of Hagar and Ishmael was real, regardless of how it all worked out in the end. The family trauma was genuine, even if healing eventually occurred. The injustice of Sarah's jealousy wasn't erased by the subsequent blessings that followed. This tension between divine sovereignty and human responsibility runs throughout the entire narrative. God's ability to bring good from evil doesn't excuse the evil itself. His power to redeem suffering doesn't justify the infliction of suffering. His capacity to work through broken situations doesn't make the brokenness any less tragic. The scandal of Abraham's first son ultimately forces us to live with mystery and ambiguity rather than neat theological explanations. It refuses to let us reduce complex moral situations to simple formulas or easy answers. And perhaps that's exactly what our world needs right now. In an age of religious extremism and political polarization, Abraham's family story offers a different model. It shows us characters who are neither completely good nor completely bad, situations that are neither completely just nor completely unjust, and outcomes that are neither completely satisfying nor completely tragic. The real lesson of Abraham's first son might be that life is messier than our theologies, that families are more complex than our ideologies, and that God's ways are more mysterious than our certainties. But here's the hope buried within this ancient scandal. If Isaac and Ishmael could find their way back to each other despite everything that had torn them apart, then perhaps their modern descendants can do the same. If two brothers could stand together at their father's grave, despite the trauma of their childhood separation, then maybe there's still hope for healing the divisions that seem so permanent and irreconcilable today. The scandal of Abraham's first son doesn't end with ancient history. It continues every time we choose reconciliation over revenge, understanding over hatred, and healing over division. It's a scandal that calls us to be better than our ancestors' worst moments, while learning from their eventual wisdom. The question isn't really who was Abraham's first son. The question is what we're going to do with the legacy of both his sons. Will we continue to use their story to justify our conflicts, or will we follow their example of adult reconciliation and mutual respect? That choice will determine whether the scandal of Abraham's first son continues to fuel division and violence, or whether it finally becomes what it was always meant to be. A story of hope, healing, and the possibility that even the most broken families can find their way back to love. The scandal has been hiding in plain sight for 4,000 years. Now you know the truth. The question is, what are you going to do with it? If this journey through Abraham's family scandal has opened your eyes to new possibilities for understanding ancient stories and modern conflicts, make sure to hit that subscribe button and share this video with others who need to hear this message. And let us know in the comments what aspect of this story surprised you the most. The conversation doesn't end here. It's just beginning.